Well, good evening. It is just about 6:30 and we're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute. I would like to open with a word of prayer, and so let's go ahead and pray and then we'll jump right into it this evening. Father, I thank you for being with us, for watching over us and keeping us. And Father, I pray that you would bless this time together, that you would allow us to see into your word, that it would allow us to be able to understand some things about perhaps where we focus our attentions and think about things. Father, I pray that you would just be with us as we gather and just continue praying for the direction of the church, and that you would just continue to lead us and guide us in all that is said and done. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, you might wonder, since Growing Places is finished, what we're going to do on Wednesday nights. Well, the board and I met on Sunday, and we have decided that we're going to continue the schedule as we have for the past several weeks. Sunday morning service, no Sunday school, no Wednesday night services, and no Sunday night services in the building. Now, there's a lot of reasons that go into it that I won't go into, but primarily we are going to meet as a board on Sunday night and Wednesday night during the service times, and we are going to be praying about the direction of the church. And so I'm recording this early and it's premiering. You may wonder why it's premiering instead of me actually being live. It's premiering because while this is playing, the board and I are meeting and praying about the direction of where we should be going and how we should be going about it. Now, I shared with the board one of the things that is kind of in the forefront about all of this is that I know a lot of people are anxious to get back to normal. That's pretty much the consistent phrase that I hear all the time. The reality is, our attendance had started to decline, our participation had begun to decline, our desire to really seemingly grow seems to have been decreasing before this all hit. With all of the controversy that's in our world today and everything that's going on around us, that doesn't seem to be changing a lot of things. As I've monitored and tried to keep up with who's watching and seeing who's been engaging in the videos that we have and things like that, it has dropped tremendously with the participation that has been ongoing over the past several weeks. And so the idea of getting back to normal is really a dangerous idea in such a setting. Because if we just get back to normal, are people really engaging in the word? We can have all of the normal service times, but if people aren't studying the word, if they're not engaging in it, if they're not praying and seeking God, are we accomplishing what our mission is? And so rather than jump back into just having services, which are kind of going through the motions, having times together so that we can sit down and be there listening to a service, but it really not penetrating, we are going to spend the next several weeks in a fervent prayer as a board coming together, seeking God's direction as to what we should be doing going forward, not only in service times, but in how we are reaching people. We are praying for people by name. We are praying for you. And we are calling upon God to really awaken within us a desire to seek deeply into wanting to have a closer relationship with Him. And so over the next several weeks, at least up through the middle of August, the schedule will be the same. It will be Sunday morning at 10:30, and then we will have a study online on Wednesday night. I'll do one for probably record it and post it live to come up as a premiere so that the board and I will have time as we are gathering to pray. So I say all of that to say this. That is kind of an overview of what was going to happen. We won't be having any more growing places. And so I wanted to kind of alert you to that again, remind you of that. As far as the study time, It'll kind of vary. It'll flex. It's not going to be a hard and fast hour study. It's not going to be a 30-minute study always. It's going to be what I feel led to do in a given time frame, in a given night. And so tonight, I want to look at this, and there's this verse that really has been in my heart and in my mind. And it kind of goes along with what the direction of our board is going on. And it's taken from Philippians 4:8. In Philippians 4:8 and 9, it reads, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent and praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you." Now, that couple of verses speaks to me in a very bold fashion. Whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, lovely, admirable, think on those things. And the second portion of this, the God of peace will be with you. If we are not focusing our attentions on what is pure and lovely and admirable, what is right and noble, how can we possibly have the peace of God? Because if Paul says that if those are the things that we're thinking about, that the God of peace will be with us, then there's an obverse of that if we are thinking of other things, if we're thinking of detrimental things, if we're thinking of all of the difficulties in the world around us, if we're focusing on all of the negativity, how can the God of peace be with us if he is only going to be present when those are the positive things are what we're thinking about? And so then I began to look into scriptures, and I began to look at this word think and its other versions, other forms, other tenses. And so I searched the scriptures, and there are over 200 uses of the word think or thought throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then I began to read some of the scriptures where this word think or thought comes into being. And I wanted to share some of those this evening. In Genesis chapter 31, Jacob has been this character that up to this point he was born, his twin brother Esau, he's taken his birthright, he's taken his blessing, he's run off and he's gone to his uncle Laban's home. He married his love, or he thought, but it turned out to be her sister. And so then he gets to marry his other wife, and he gets the concubines, and he has the children. And you can read about all of this in Genesis, and it tells the story of Jacob. Now, Jacob's sons began to be concerned about how wealthy Jacob was becoming. Or Laban's sons were concerned about how wealthy Jacob was becoming. And there was a lot of murmuring. And so Jacob picks up his family, and he talks to his wives, Laban's daughters, and he says, we need to just leave. We need to go back to where I came from. We need to get up. We need to leave. And so they do. Now, while they are traveling, Laban comes back, finds them missing. So he chases them down. Genesis 31:31, Jacob is speaking face to face with Laban. And Laban wants to know, why did you run off with my daughters, my grandkids? Why? What possessed you to do that? And it says, Jacob answered Laban, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. So rather than understanding the bigger picture, rather than seeking God's guidance and counsel, Jacob runs, which is not atypical for Jacob at this point. But what did he think? He thought that his wives were going to be taken by force. Now, the reason why he had run in the first place from his brother Esau was because he had stolen his brother's birthright. He is now going back home, And so he has this encounter with Laban. God had spoken to Laban and said, don't touch him, don't harm him, just let him go. And so Laban obeyed. So Jacob is going back. He's got these wives and these concubines and all these kids. And as he's coming back, his brother had threatened to kill him before he left. And so Jacob is completely unsure as to what he's walking into. And so he's headed back to where he came from. And a messenger, in Genesis 32, starting at verse 6, it says, the messenger had gone out to talk with Esau. And when the messenger returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. So in Jacob's thinking, at first he's concerned that Laban is going to take his wife and his family away from him. Secondly, he comes to this point that somebody he has wronged is coming out and he's bringing 400 men, and Jacob thinks that he's coming to attack. Now, this puts Jacob in a very difficult situation because he has all of his wives, all of his children, all of his possessions. So his plan is, I will split them in half, and I'll only lose half if Esau comes and attacks. Now, which half is going to die? He doesn't have any thinking about that. He just thinks that, well, Esau is going to come. Perhaps he will only slaughter half of my people. Well, in the end, what happens is God brings healing and restoration between Jacob and Esau. There is no bloodshed, and there is nothing that is going to go in and cause him the distress that he is concerned about. And so Jacob's thinking was errant thinking. He didn't lose his family. He didn't lose his possessions. He didn't lose his wives. But those are the things that he was focused on, was what he was potentially going to lose. Do you think there was any peace in his heart and in his life with those kinds of things going on? Well, let's go and look at another story. In the story of Joseph and his brothers, Joseph is one of the sons of Jacob, and he was the favored one. And he was the one that his father Jacob had given him a coat that was a very colorful coat. His brothers didn't like him, so he came walking across the field one day to come and check on them. They saw him in the distance. Some of them said, let's kill him. Some of them said, let's throw him in this well. He ended up being sold into slavery. He got taken into Egypt. He works in the house of Potiphar, who is second in command. He has Potiphar's wife makes a pass at him, and when he doesn't respond, she lies and gets him thrown in jail. Then he comes out of jail because Pharaoh has a dream. This is all a lengthy story. But as he comes to this point, Joseph's family had been in a place that they were suffering because of the famine that had hit the land. And so they go to Egypt to get grain. Joseph realized who they were, and they did not recognize who he was. So when they got their grain and they left, Joseph had the porters to hide the silver that they had brought to pay for the grain, to hide the silver back in their bags and send them on their way. Now, when they did that, there was a lot more to the story, and one of the brothers had been left behind because he was there kind of as a hostage for the father, or the younger brother, who would be Benjamin, was supposed to be brought back. They say, we're going home. Jacob says, we're not sending anybody back. I've already lost one son. I don't want to lose the other. And so they have to go back and they have to get more grain. Now, when they go back to get more grain, in Genesis chapter 43, this is something that is kind of interesting because in Genesis 43:18, this is what happens because they come back to Egypt to buy more grain. And it says, now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house because they'd been taken to Joseph's house. They thought, we were brought here because of all the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. Well, I have news for you. What Joseph actually ends up doing is revealing himself as their long-lost brother. He has their father sent for and brings him to Egypt. The family is reunited. The people of Israel are protected because of Joseph's influence in Egypt. But his brothers, well, they thought only negative things. They were fearful because of what they were thinking. Well, he's going to make us slaves. He's going to take everything that we've got. Well, let's look at another story from the Old Testament. In the book of Judges, we read another situation where there is this man who's named Samson. He is one of the judges of Israel. Now, Samson had extremely great amounts of strength, and he was this incredibly painful existence for the Philistines. And so they sent this woman, Delilah, to try to find out his strength. Why was he so strong? Why was he able to be so effective in battle? And so he succumbs to Delilah's whims, and she asks him, and he tells her a lie, and then she tries it and says, the Philistines are upon you, and he jumps up, he breaks free every time. And finally, she comes to the point, she says, you just don't love me. If you did, you would tell me what is the source of your strength. And so Samson eventually gives her the secret. She does what he says, is going to take it away, cuts his hair. In Judges 16, what happens is that she cuts his hair, he falls asleep while she's cutting his hair, or she is actually cutting it while he's asleep. And it says, then she called, in Judges 16:20, it says, then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and he thought, I'll go out before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles. They set him to grinding grain in the prison. Now, in Samson's case, he doesn't have negative thoughts. He doesn't have fearful thoughts. He has these thoughts of, I am in control and I will do what I need to do. He wakes up from the sleep and he thinks that he is invincible because he always has been. But Samson actually thinks far too much of himself. You see, in each one of these things, the thing that is happening, what they are thinking about, is not actually reality. In the story of Ruth and Naomi, in the book of Ruth, Naomi and her husband and 2 sons leave their homeland because of a famine. They go to an area where they are able to settle down, and their sons marry, and then the sons die. Naomi's husband dies. Naomi says, I'm going back to home. And so she's getting ready to leave, and the daughters-in-law are with her, and they are going to follow her back home. Now, in Ruth chapter 1, this is kind of a precursor as to what happens. But starting at verse 11, here was Naomi's response to her daughters-in-law coming with her. It says, but Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Even if I thought that this was possible, this is a voice of someone who has just completely given up. If I thought that there was any hope for me, I'd encourage you to stay. But I don't have any hope for me. I have no hope for a son. I have nothing for you. God is against me. So Naomi's thoughts are very obviously in a negative place. They are in a very difficult place. She's in a lot of pain, but it's because her world has come crashing down all around her. You know, a lot of the struggles that we're seeing in our world today, people have a lot of very negative thoughts. They see things as being taken apart, being broken down. But these negative thoughts, they're not necessarily reality. Because in Naomi's case, not only does Ruth follow her, Ruth ends up having this man, Boaz, who comes to her rescue, who marries her, who then has a child with her. And as they have this son, Ruth and Boaz come together and they have a son, and their son has a son, and that son has a son who becomes the king, King David. And if you look at the genealogies of Jesus Christ, what you find is it travels all the way through that genealogy from Ruth to Jesus Christ. And yet Naomi had given up all hope. If I thought there was hope for me, this was her response when they wanted to come with her. If Ruth had turned around and gone back home, what would have happened with the genealogy of Jesus centuries later? Well, we go on. Now, there is a situation where when you get into the stories of Elijah and Elisha is the second one that comes. There was a situation where there was, I believe it was a Syrian army officer whose name was Naaman. Now, Naaman was a commander, and Naaman was well respected, but Naaman had leprosy. Now, there was a slave girl that was taken captive from the Israelites, taken into captivity, and she said to the I think it's the Syrians, that there was the ability in Israel, there was a man who could heal Naaman. So Naaman speaks to his master, his leader, and he says, go for it. And so they send an offering to the king of Israel. He's beside himself because he doesn't know what's going to happen. And then Elisha steps into the picture. And so in 2 Kings chapter 5, we pick up the story in a verse 8. And it says, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and be cleansed. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and he went off in a rage. Naaman's servant went to him and he said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So he went down and he dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Naaman thought. Did you catch the point where it says that Naaman thought? He thought that Elisha was going to come out, call upon the name of the Lord, wave his hand over him, and all of a sudden it would be taken care of. And when Elisha doesn't do a healing in the fashion in which Naaman thought he should, Naaman flies into a rage. Why would Naaman be angry? Well, it was because of what he thought. He thought that Elisha was going to heal him in such and such a way, but Elisha does it a different way, and it makes him mad. So mad that he's going to just go away and retain his leprosy. But his servant comes to him and he says, if he'd have told you to go out and do something magnificent, you'd have done it. All he said to do was go dip in this river. So Naaman rethinks, because he goes down and he washes, and when he does, he's healed. Naaman's thinking was distorted, and it caused him to be furious. It almost caused him to feel as if he was not going to be able to be healed. And yet, when somebody helped him reorient his thinking, he does become healed. One more story. There's a situation in the book of Esther that there is another man whose name is Haman. Not Naaman, but Haman. And Haman hates the Israelites. And so he's trying to come up with a way to get rid of the Israelites. And what he doesn't realize is that Mordecai, who was an Israelite, had saved the king by revealing a plot to kill the king. The king has it written into the records, and then he promptly forgets about it. Well, one night, the king can't sleep, so he calls the servant in and he says, read me back the Chronicles. Just read me what's been happening so that I can kind of, tune it out and go to sleep. And he is reminded of Mordecai and what Mordecai did to help the king be saved. And he says to his servant, what did we do to pay him back? Servant says, we didn't do anything. Now, Haman comes in the next day, and he is this general in the army. He thinks very highly of himself, which is why he doesn't like Mordecai, because Mordecai wouldn't bow before him. And when he comes in, the king asks him what he would do if he wanted to honor someone for a great honor. Esther chapter 6 says, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Well, what he was actually doing was he was thinking all about himself. His focus was on himself. And when it was, he tells the king what he would do. I would put the fanciest robes on him, the best horse. I would parade him through the town, let everybody know just how much the king appreciates and loves them. And the king says, that's a good idea. Have Mordecai come in, and he did exactly that for Mordecai. Because Haman thought of himself as much better, much greater than anybody else did. So, as we look down through these stories, what we see is Jacob thinks that he's going to lose everything. And so he's all panicky and he tries to fix all of these different things. He tries to come up with a solution for all of his plans. We get to the point where the brothers of Joseph thought that they were going to be taken into slavery and then all of their stuff taken and impounded and sold. And yet they are reunited with their brother. Their family is brought to Egypt. They are protected and cared for through the famine. Samson thought, I can handle whatever is thrown my way. But what Samson didn't know was God had left him because he had turned his back one too many times on God. And so then he is taken captive, he's blinded, he's put in shackles, and he's put into work as grinding grain. Naomi thought that it was hopeless. She couldn't possibly see any way that God could make anything good out of her situation. And yet, when Ruth stays with her, Ruth gets married, Ruth has a baby, the baby grows up, has another son, follows the genealogy all the way down to Jesus Christ. Naaman comes to this point that he thinks that he is supposed to have this certain type of a healing, and when he doesn't get it, he flies into a rage because it's not being done the way he thinks it should be. And Haman comes to this point that he thought so much of himself that he gives the king this honor of what he would like to have done, only to have somebody else honored in just such a fashion. And he becomes very vindictive. Every one of these situations, and there are numerous other stories through the Old Testament and into the New Testament too, where the word think or thought is integral in the story because it reveals how these people that the stories are about, what they are thinking about. Fear, loss, abandonment, being self-sufficient, thinking more highly of themselves, thinking that there's a way that God should do things and being upset when they doesn't. All of those are illustrations of how we should not think. However, one more scripture that I want to share with you is Psalm chapter 63. It's only 11 verses, and it is a psalm of David, and he begins, "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and behold your power and your glory, because your love is better than life. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you. On my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you, your right hand upholds me. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed, they will go down to the depths of the earth. They will be given over to the sword and become food for jackals. But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced. While the mouths of liars will be silenced. You do realize that all untruth that we are confronted with are straight from Satan. It is a tool that Satan uses to confuse and to distort and to cause despair and anguish. He is the father of lies. When David writes this psalm, he comes to this point, he says, I think of you. And then he proclaims the goodness of what God has done. He is focusing all of his thoughts and his energies on praising and worshiping God. Why? Because he trusts God. He knows that God will reveal himself as God will reveal himself. Not in how that some human thinks that he should, but when all of these things that are going on around them that are not true are going on, David says they'll be silenced. They'll be closed up. So we go back to this original thought from the book of Philippians. If anything is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, think about such things. That's exactly what David did. He proclaimed the goodness of God, which allowed him to realize that even the mouths of the liars that he was being confronted with were going to be closed, that God was going to stop them in their tracks. Folks, I think that if we will pay heed to Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, we will understand that our focus needs to be on God and the things of God, the things that are noble and true and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. And here's what's going to happen. If those are the things on which we focus, if those are the things about which we think, the God of peace will be with you. My hope and my prayer is that you seek that hope and that peace because you begin to think on the things that we should be thinking about. My prayer is that as the board and I meet, that we will be crying out to God and beseeching heaven to stir within the hearts of every person, not only within our congregation, but within this entire community in this nation, to seek after these things which are pure and lovely and true and noble. Because we really, truly need the peace of God in our hearts and in our lives. And it is only the peace of God that is going to bring the peace which heals all nations. Father, I thank you for this time together. I pray that as people see this, that they would be able to take this in. And we've talked about a lot of different stories, and I hope, Father, that it helps them to be excited and encouraged to want to go back and to reread the entire accounts of these different situations. There's a lot of incredible insights that can be gained by just seeing how you work in the Old Testament. Father, a lot of times we discount the Old Testament, but people are people. Old Testament versus New Testament, people are still people. Every one of these people with which I used as illustrations, they were people who had wrong thinking. But if and when they had the right thinking, their lives began to change, as in the case of Naaman. But Father, that even when people didn't understand what was going to happen or were fearful about what the future held, you are a good God and you still brought good results. Father, I pray that you would help us as a people to think on the things which are important in our walk with you. And may you be given the freedom in our hearts and in our lives to do what you will do. And we will be blessed because we have surrendered our desires to you. Father, I ask now that you would just continually remind us that when we get discouraged or when we get overwhelmed of what we're supposed to be thinking about, and that it would change the way that we think, which then begins to bring peace, the peace that is only possible from God, into our hearts and minds. And I ask this in Jesus' precious holy name. Amen. I hope and I pray that going forward, you will be thinking on the right things and experiencing the peace of God. Good night.